The John Wayne Gacy case, diving into the mind of the killer clown, true crime. Chapter 1, The Man Who Built His Own Tomb. In the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of 1970s Chicago, specifically in the unincorporated area of Norwood Park Township, there was a man who seemed to personify the American dream as it was sold to the working class. He was a self-made man, a successful contractor whose PDM contractor's van was a familiar sight. He was a Democratic precinct captain, a man with a photograph of himself shaking First Lady Rosalind Carter's hand, proudly displayed in his home. He was a beloved local figure, famous for hosting elaborate summer parties where neighbors, politicians, and police officers mingled in his backyard, enjoying barbecue and beer. And most famously, he was a man who would don a ruffled collar and grease paint, transforming into Pogo the Clown to bring laughter to children in hospitals and at local parades. His name was John Wayne Gacy, a man everyone thought they knew, a man everyone liked. But beneath the floorboards of his neat, unassuming ranch-style home on Summerdale Avenue, in the dark, cloying earth of his crawlspace, he was meticulously building a tomb. The story of John Wayne Gacy is not one of a spectral outcast, like Dahmer, or a charismatic drifter like Bundy. It is a story of terrifying, seamless integration. Gacy was a monster who did not lurk in the shadows. He stood proudly in the spotlight, using his community status, his political connections, and his affable, backslapping persona as the ultimate camouflage. While he was organizing neighborhood events and charming the city's elite, the cramped space beneath his home was slowly, methodically filling with the bodies of the dozens of teenage boys and young men he had lured to their deaths. He did not need to hunt in the shadows because his victims came to him, drawn in by the promise of a job from a man everyone trusted. The disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast on the cold evening of December 11th, 1978, was the single loose thread that would ultimately unravel Gacy's intricately woven world of lies. Peast was a good kid from a good family, and his vanishing was an anomaly that could not be ignored. When investigators from the Des Plaines Police Department began their cautious inquiry into the friendly local contractor who was the last person to see him, they had no idea they were standing on the precipice of a mass grave, on the verge of uncovering one of the most prolific and horrifying serial killers in American history. The case would shock the nation, not just for the staggering number of victims, but for the profound and sickening betrayal it represented. The man who dressed as a clown to embody joy was, in reality, a predator who weaponized trust itself. This story, explored in documentaries and the chilling Netflix series Conversations with a Killer, the John Wayne Gacy tapes, forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question. How can a man live two lives so completely, so seamlessly, without a single crack in the facade? We will dig beneath the surface of the perfect neighbor, the dedicated citizen, the funny clown, to find the twisted psychological architecture that allowed him to host parties in his backyard while his victims decomposed just a few feet below. To understand John Gacy is to understand that the most dangerous masks are not worn by clowns at a circus, but by the friendly neighbors we trust and invite into our homes. Chapter 2, The Unwanted Son. To find the roots of the man who craved absolute, tyrannical control, we must travel back to the rigid, emotionally barren atmosphere of a working-class Chicago home in the 1940s and 50s. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, into a family ruled by the iron and often drunken fist of his father, John Stanley Gacy, an auto machinist and a first-generation Polish-American. The elder Gacy was a man forged in the Great Depression, a hard-drinking, abusive tyrant who viewed his only son as a constant, bitter disappointment. He mercilessly belittled John for being clumsy and unathletic, deriding him as a sissy and a failure, and convincing him he was fundamentally stupid. The father's word was absolute law, his explosive anger a constant terrifying presence that saturated the air in their small home. Any perceived weakness was met with scorn or a leather strap. Young John grew up desperate for a single crumb of his father's approval, but could never seem to earn it. He was a sensitive boy in a home that had no room for sensitivity, a place where emotion was a liability. A head injury from a swing set at age 11 left him with frightening blackouts, episodes his father dismissed as pathetic, attention-seeking lies. These were later diagnosed as a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, but for the most crucial years of his development, they were simply another source of shame and paternal scorn. The message Gacy received day after day was brutally clear. His body was weak, his feelings were invalid, and he was a fundamentally flawed human being. This constant barrage of psychological abuse created a deep, simmering well of resentment and a powerful, subconscious vow to one day become the one in charge, the one who could never be called weak or helpless again. He learned early and well how to perform, how to build a mask. He became a master of creating a public facade that was the polar opposite of his private reality. In the world outside his home, he was eager to please, a hard worker, a joiner. He poured his energy into activities where he could exert a small measure of control and earn the respect that was denied him at home, like the Jaycees, a civic organization where he would later thrive. This was the beginning of the great duality that would define his life, the construction of an impeccable, admired public self to mask the damaged, rage-filled, and deeply insecure self that was festering in private. Adding to this internal pressure, Gacy was discovering his own homosexual urges, feelings that, in the hyper-masculine Catholic environment of mid-century Chicago, were not just taboo, but were considered a profound perversion, a sin. This added another thick layer of secrecy and self-loathing to his already fractured identity. He was living a lie at home, and now he was forced to live a lie about his own nature. The stage was being set for a man who would spend his life obsessed with projecting an image of absolute power and unimpeachable normalcy, while his secret self, twisted by shame, began fantasizing about a world where he could exert the ultimate, final control over others. Chapter 3. The Mask of the Model Citizen. As John Gacy entered adulthood, he channeled his desperate, gnawing need for approval into a ferocious, all-consuming ambition. He was determined to become the very man his father never believed he could be, successful, respected, and undeniably powerful. In the early 1960s, he moved to Waterloo, Iowa, after marrying a co-worker's daughter, seeing the move as a chance to completely reinvent himself. There, he began to meticulously construct his public persona, brick by respectable brick. He became a pillar of the community, the kind of energetic, can-do man that everyone admired. He joined the local chapter of the Jaycees, and with his boundless energy and organizational skills, quickly rose through the ranks. He was a master of appearing competent and friendly, and his efforts paid off. He was named Man of the Year, photographed with local dignitaries, and celebrated as a civic leader. It was during this time that he discovered his love for playing the clown. He invented Pogo, a character with a pointed white hat, a ruffled collar, and a signature painted smile. He began performing at local events, fundraisers, and children's parties. This was the perfect mask, an ideal vessel for his duality. It allowed him to be the adored center of attention while remaining completely hidden. A clown is friendly, non-threatening, a figure of pure joy. No one questions the man behind the makeup. This persona gave him access, acceptance, and a level of implicit trust that would later become a terrifying tool in his predatory arsenal. But behind this carefully polished facade of civic duty and painted smiles, his secret self was beginning to act on its violent impulses. In 1968, the mask slipped catastrophically. Gacy was arrested and convicted of sodomy for coercing a teenage boy who worked for him into sexual acts. His perfect world built with such painstaking effort, came crashing down. The model citizen was exposed as a predator. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but ever the performer, he immediately set about manipulating the system from within. He became a model inmate, managing the prison kitchen, organizing events, and flawlessly convincing the parole board that he was reformed, rehabilitated, and deeply remorseful. He was released after serving just 18 months. He returned to the Chicago area, vowing to rebuild his life, but this time on his own terms. He started his own contracting business, PDM contractors, painting, decorating, and maintenance. He was a savvy, if ruthless, businessman and soon became wealthier and more successful than ever before. He remarried and bought the house on Summerdale Avenue that would become his lair. He became deeply involved in local Democratic politics, using his business to do favors for officials and rising to the position of precinct captain. He had resurrected his public persona, making it more powerful and seemingly impenetrable than before. He was no longer just a local JC. He was a political player, a successful entrepreneur, a friend to the powerful. But this time, he would ensure his secret life was never discovered again. He would build a world where he was in complete, absolute control. A world where his victims would never be able to tell his secrets, because they would never, ever leave. Chapter 4. The House on Summerdale Avenue. With the purchase of the home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, John Gacy acquired his kingdom, his hunting ground, and his tomb. The modest, three-bedroom ranch house was his stage, the place where his two lives would intersect with lethally efficient consequences. To the outside world, it was the proud home of a successful businessman, the site of legendary summer parties with horseshoe pits, a swimming pool, and a custom-built bar in the basement that Gacy had constructed himself. But the house held a secret, horrifying geography. The garage was often his initial assault room, the place where the friendly mask would drop. His bedroom was a theater of terror, and the small, dark, damp crawl space beneath the home, accessible through a closet, was where he would bury his secrets. Gacy's method of killing was a ghastly ritual of absolute domination, a horrifying inversion of the powerlessness and helplessness he had felt as a child under the thumb of his father. He primarily targeted teenage boys and young men, many of whom were runaways or had come to him seeking employment. They were vulnerable, often estranged from their families, and in desperate need of a job or a place to stay, which made them perfect, invisible prey. He would use his authority as a boss, the promise of work, or the lure of alcohol and drugs to bring them into the privacy of his home. Once there, his favorite tactic was to use a magic trick involving handcuffs, convincing his victim it was a harmless game before revealing his true, monstrous intentions. The click of the cuffs was the sound of the trap springing shut. The killing itself was brutal, intimate, and designed for maximum control. His signature method was what he gruesomely called the rope trick. He would slip a length of rope around the victim's neck and then insert a short stick or tool handle under it, using it as a tourniquet. He would then twist it, slowly and deliberately garroting them. This method was not quick. It was a slow, terrifying act of strangulation that allowed him to watch the life drain from his victim's eyes. It was the ultimate horrifying expression of power for a man who had spent his entire life feeling powerless. In those final agonizing moments, he was in complete control of another human being's existence. He was no longer the weak, pathetic son his father had ridiculed. He was a god, holding the absolute power of life and death. After the murder, the disposal of the body was a grim, practical task he undertook with chilling efficiency. He would often leave the bodies in the crawl space for a time before burial. He then wrapped the victims in plastic and buried them in the dark earth, sometimes with the unwitting help of other young men who worked for him, telling them they were just burying construction debris or a dead dog. He methodically filled the space, one body after another, packing them in with quicklime to try and manage the ever-worsening smell of decomposition. When the crawl space was finally full, he began dumping his victims in the nearby Des Plaines River, the house on Somerdale Avenue, the ultimate symbol of his public success, had become a private mausoleum, a monument to his secret rage, built on a foundation of bones. Chapter 5. The Clown in the Public Eye. When the news broke in the final, cold days of December 1978 that the remains of multiple young men had been found buried in the home of a respected local businessman, the public reaction was one of profound, staggering disbelief. This was not some shadowy drifter or a known degenerate. This was John Gacy, the gregarious precinct captain, the successful contractor, the man who dressed as Pogo the Clown for charity. The image that immediately and permanently seared itself into the national consciousness was the jarring, grotesque juxtaposition of the smiling, white-faced clown with the grim, unfolding horror story. It became a cultural trauma, a moment of collective shock. The clown, a symbol of childhood innocence, fun and laughter, was now forever linked to the image of a predatory, calculating monster Chicago, a city known for its tough, no-nonsense politics and infamous mob history, was no stranger to crime. But this was different. This struck at the very heart of the social contract. Gacy hadn't just broken the law, he had perverted the fundamental rules of community, trust, and neighborliness. The media descended on Somerdale Avenue, turning the quiet suburban street into a chaotic television set, broadcasting the grim excavation to a horrified nation. For days, the public watched, mesmerized and repulsed, as investigators in protective gear carried body bag after body bag out of the quiet suburban home. The final count was almost incomprehensible. 29 victims unearthed from his property, with at least 4 more recovered from the river. The scale of the carnage was simply beyond what most people could fathom. The case ignited a firestorm of fear and paranoia that swept across the country. Parents looked at their teenage sons and suddenly saw a world of hidden dangers, dangers that lurked not in dark alleys, but in the seemingly safe homes of friendly, helpful men. The familiar axiom of stranger danger suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. Gacy was no stranger. He was a fixture of the community, a man whose word was trusted. The story also forced a difficult and often ugly public conversation about homosexuality, which Gacy's lawyers would later try to weaponize in his defense. In the less enlightened atmosphere of the late 1970s, the case was often framed by the media in a way that conflated his sexual orientation with his violent pathology, adding another layer of complexity, fear, and prejudice to the public reaction. The emotions the case stirred were potent: disgust at the depravity of the crimes, but also a deep, unsettling sense of betrayal that cut to the core. If a man like John Gacy, a man so visible and so respected, could hide such a monumental secret, then who else could? The story of the killer clown became a modern-day boogeyman, a true and terrifying cautionary tale that eroded the comforting belief that evil is something that looks and acts evil. Gacy proved in the most horrific way imaginable that the most monstrous acts could be hidden behind the most ordinary, even benevolent, of masks. Chapter 6. A Trail of Scent and Silence. The investigation that finally brought down the empire of John Gacy was not a single eureka moment, but a slow, painstaking process of connecting dots that had been ignored or dismissed for years. Throughout the mid-1970s, as teenage boys and young men disappeared one by one from the streets of the Chicago area, police departments were ill-equipped and disinclined to see a pattern. Cases were handled by different jurisdictions with little communication between them. Many of the victims were initially classified as runaways, a low priority for overworked police forces. It was a killer's perfect hunting ground, an ecosystem of institutional silence and indifference in which a predator could thrive. The beginning of the end came with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest on December 11, 1978. Piest was a responsible, hard-working kid from a stable, loving family who held a part-time job at a local pharmacy in Des Plaines. He vanished after telling his mother he was going outside to talk to a local contractor about a potential summer job that paid well. That contractor was John Gacy. Unlike many of Gacy's other victims, Robert Piest was not a runaway or a drifter. His family immediately knew something was terribly wrong and applied immense, unrelenting pressure on the Des Plaines Police Department. This was the key difference: a victim whose absence created an immediate, loud and powerful alarm that could not be ignored. The lead investigator, Detective Joe Kozenjak, quickly and correctly focused on Gacy as his prime suspect. The contractor's story about the night Piest disappeared was full of inconsistencies, and a background check soon revealed his prior conviction for sodomy in Iowa, a fact that immediately raised massive red flags. But Gacy was a confident, arrogant, and manipulative performer. He played the part of the cooperative, wrongly accused citizen, even joking and making small talk with the officers who were assigned to tail him around the clock. The investigation turned into a tense, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The police knew Gacy was their man, but they had no body, no weapon, and no direct evidence. The pressure was immense. The breakthrough came from Gacy's own house, the source of his power and ultimately his downfall. A search warrant allowed police to enter the home, where they were met with a faint but undeniable foul odor that Gacy tried to explain away as moisture and dead rodents in the crawl space. More damningly, they found items belonging to other missing boys, trophies Gacy had foolishly kept. The final piece of the puzzle that allowed for a second, more intensive search warrant was a receipt from the pharmacy where Robert Piest worked, found in the pocket of one of Gacy's jackets. But the definitive, ghastly proof was still buried. It was only after a young officer, driven by a gut feeling and the escalating smell, squeezed into the claustrophobic crawl space and dug into the dirt with his hands, that the first human remains were discovered. The scent was no longer faint. It was the overwhelming, suffocating stench of a mass grave. The silence of years was finally horrifically broken. Chapter 7. The Arrogance of a Killer. John Gacy's trial, which commenced in early 1980, was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated narcissism. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was smarter than everyone in the room, the prosecutors, the judge, the jury, and even his own defense team. This arrogance was his fatal flaw. During his initial interrogation, he had not only confessed to the killings, but had meticulously drawn a map for the stunned investigators, a crude blueprint of his crawl space, showing where each body was buried. His confession was chillingly detached and clinical, as if he were discussing a problematic construction project. He referred to the murders as taking care of them, or getting rid of them, a logistical problem to be managed, rather than a series of human lives he had extinguished. Faced with this mountain of physical evidence and his own detailed confession, the only possible defense was one of insanity. His lawyers, led by a young Sam Amirante, were forced to argue that Gacy was a victim of a split personality. They claimed that the murders were committed by an alternate evil personality named Jack, while the good, community-loving John had no knowledge of these horrific acts. They presented a narrative of a man suffering from a profound mental disease, a man not responsible for his actions. The prosecution, led by the formidable William Kunkel, methodically and relentlessly dismantled this defense. Kunkel portrayed Gacy as a cunning, manipulative predator who was in complete and total control of his actions. A man who planned his crimes, selected his victims, and meticulously covered his tracks. Gacy himself was an active and often disruptive participant in his own defense, frequently whispering instructions to his lawyers and attempting to charm the jury with smiles and nods. His arrogance was palpable, filling the courtroom. He seemed to view the trial as his final grand performance, his last chance to be the undisputed center of the world's attention. He showed not a flicker of remorse. Instead, He painted himself as the true victim, a victim of his abusive father, of his uncontrollable urges, of a society that didn't understand him. His testimony on the stand was a rambling, self-pitying, and often incoherent monologue that did nothing but expose his grandiose and manipulative nature. The jury saw straight through the performance. They listened for 6 weeks to the gruesome evidence, the heart-wrenching stories of the boys he had murdered, and the cold, calculated way he had hidden their bodies like so much trash. They looked at the man who had built a tomb under his own home and saw not a sick man, but a profoundly and consciously evil one. On March 12, 1980, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. The following day, they recommended the death penalty. John Gacy's greatest performance was over. The audience had delivered its final damning review. Chapter 8. The Artist on Death Row. John Wayne Gacy spent 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. This extended period was not one of quiet reflection, atonement, or repentance. Instead, Gacy embarked on his final and perhaps most bizarre public act. He reinvented himself as an artist. From the confines of his prison cell, he began painting, churning out hundreds of canvases that became objects of morbid fascination. His subjects were often unsettlingly cheerful or bizarrely pop culture focused. Portraits of the Seven Dwarfs, Elvis Presley, Jesus Christ, famous actors, and, most chillingly and frequently, self-portraits of himself in his guise as Pogo the Clown. This art became a new and powerful tool for Gacy's lifelong campaign of manipulation. He would sell the paintings to collectors, true crime enthusiasts, and other morbidly curious individuals, often for thousands of dollars. He used the proceeds to fund his extensive legal appeals, and more importantly, to maintain a sense of power and control over the outside world. Through his art, he was able to project his persona beyond the prison walls, to continue to have an impact, to force people to still think about him. The act of painting clowns was a final, defiant act of supreme narcissism, reclaiming the very image that had defined his monstrous duality and turning it into a commodity. It was his way of saying that even in a cage, awaiting death, he was still Pogo, still the one pulling the strings, still the star of the show. During his years in prison, he gave numerous interviews to journalists and profilers, always maintaining a thick veneer of arrogance and consistently deflecting any true responsibility for his crimes. He would blame the victims, callously claiming they were prostitutes or runaways who got what they deserved because of their lifestyle. He never once expressed a shred of genuine empathy for the dozens of families he had shattered. His confessions were clinical, his explanations entirely self-serving. He saw his life story as a tragic drama in which he was the misunderstood protagonist, a victim of fate and circumstance. As his execution date finally approached in 1994, his appeals ran out. On May 10th, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final prepared statement was a rambling, defiant, and bizarre claim of innocence, blaming the system and the media. When asked if he had any final words, his response was pure, unadulterated Gacy. Reports from witnesses claim his last words were a snarled, "Kiss my ass." He went to his death exactly as he had lived, a performer, a narcissist, and a man utterly and profoundly devoid of remorse. Even in the face of his own annihilation, he refused to let the mask of arrogance slip. Chapter 9. The Mind of the Tyrant. The psychological profile of John Wayne Gacy reveals a man driven by a pathological and insatiable need for power, control, and domination, a need born from a childhood of profound humiliation, abuse, and emotional starvation. The clinical consensus points to a severe and classic case of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. pathologically intertwined with the utter lack of conscience characteristic of antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. This combination created a uniquely dangerous predator who was both grandiose in his self-perception and completely without empathy for his victims. Unlike Dahmer's pathetic, inwardly focused loneliness, Gacy's motivation was outwardly tyrannical. He needed to dominate, degrade, and destroy others to feel whole, to silence the voice of his father in his head. His narcissism was the absolute core of his being. He possessed a deeply inflated sense of his own importance and entitlement, which served as a fragile defense mechanism against the crippling feelings of worthlessness instilled in him by his abusive father. His relentless pursuit of community status, his rise in the JCs, his business success, his political involvement, was all part of building an external monument to his own perceived greatness. This public adoration was narcissistic supply, the fuel he needed to live. However, when this external validation was not enough to quiet his inner demons, his secret self required a more absolute, more primal form of validation, the total subjugation and annihilation of another human being. His antisocial, psychopathic traits allowed him to pursue this dark need without a hint of remorse or guilt. He saw other people, particularly the young men he targeted, not as fellow humans with lives, hopes, and families, but as objects for his gratification, pawns in his psychodrama. He lacked the internal brakes of conscience that stop most people from harming others. The murders were the ultimate act of control, a ritualized correction of the power imbalance of his own childhood. In the act of strangulation, as he watched the life leave his victims, he was not just ending a life. He was finally and repeatedly killing the helpless boy being beaten and belittled by his father. He became the all-powerful figure, the tyrant who held the ultimate power, the one who decided who lived and who died. His double life as Pogo the Clown was a masterstroke of this pathology, a perfect and terrifying fusion of his need for public adoration and his predatory nature. The clown mask allowed him to be the beloved center of attention while completely hiding his true self. It gave him unparalleled access to the very type of victim he preyed upon, the young, the trusting, the vulnerable. The clown was the ultimate symbol of his public persona, friendly, harmless, and trustworthy. But beneath the grease paint and the painted smile was the face of a cold, calculating tyrant, a man who would use that sacred trust as his most effective lure to drag his victims into the dark crawl space where he, and only he, was king. Chapter 10. The Crawl Space in the Soul. John Wayne Gacy did not just leave behind a legacy of bodies. He left behind a legacy of profound and lasting distrust. He shattered the comforting suburban illusion that evil is something external, something that comes from outside the neat boundaries of the community. He proved, in the most horrific way imaginable, that it can grow from within, nurtured in the soil of a picture-perfect neighborhood and hidden behind the facade of a model citizen. His house on Summerdale Avenue became a dark and enduring symbol of this truth, that a foundation of apparent normalcy, of backyard barbecues and civic pride, can conceal a crawl space filled with unthinkable secrets and unimaginable pain. The image of the killer clown has become a permanent and unsettling fixture in our cultural landscape, a powerful shorthand for the concept of corrupted innocence. Gacy took a symbol of universal joy and twisted it into a mask for predation, and in doing so, he made the world feel a little less safe, a little more uncertain. He's a chilling reminder that the most successful monsters are often the ones who are masters of disguise, who understand how to expertly use the very tools of community, friendship, authority, charity, and trust as their most devastating weapons. As we close this final, grim file, we are left with the chilling architecture of Gacy's mind. His was not a life of quiet desperation, but one of loud, relentless public performance, all of it designed to hide the rotting secret in the foundation of his soul. He did not kill because he was a social outcast. He killed because it was the only way he could feel like the ultimate insider, the one with a secret, terrible power that no one else could comprehend. His life and his carefully constructed lies poses a deeply unsettling question about the nature of the masks we all wear and the secrets we all keep. How much of what we present to the world is a performance designed to conceal our own hidden crawl spaces? And in the quiet, dark, and private places of our own minds, what truths do we choose to bury? If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to explore other true crimes that have shocked the world and the minds behind them.